midterms, quizzes, exams, finals, and tests. Students hate to fail them, and many teachers hate to assign that failing grade. Students and teachers can hope the class understands the material and the final will be a piece of cake. But more often than not, both teachers and students are surprised with their low final grades. Many students, and even teachers, will blame the test itself for the class's failure. They may claim the early quiz questions were too easy compared to what ended up on the final exam. Or they might complain their mind just went blank even though they reviewed the material over and over the night before. But I'm here to argue that testing is not only unfairly reviled, but is actually underutilized and misused in classroom settings. That's right, I'm arguing in favor of more tests. Testing is commonly used as an evaluation tool. Teachers are encouraged to use both formative and summative evaluations to mark the progress of learning. Formative evaluations include things like quizzes that mark the progress of material as it's being learned. Summative evaluations include things like midterms and finals that give you a summary of how much the students learned overall. This makes sense, right? If students have difficulties on the quizzes, the teacher can adapt the lesson plan to address the weaknesses before the final exam. However, what explains the fact that students sometimes do poorly on quizzes only to do surprisingly well on tests? Or, more commonly, do well on quizzes to do surprisingly bad later? To put it simply, formative assessments, like quizzes, that take place during learning are not always reliable indicators of what will be retained later. Think about testing as a measure of memory. We hope that students retain material they're taught long after they're out of our classrooms, but poorly timed quizzes may be measuring short-term learning rather than long-term learning. Psychological researchers did a study where they compared two different study strategies in measures of short and long-term learning. One group of students studied a text 4 times in a row. They were repeatedly reading the text over and over again. This sounds kind of like cramming or a last-minute review session. The second group of students studied the text once and tested themselves 3 times in a row. You can think about this testing kind of like using flashcards to quiz yourself on the material. 5 minutes after finishing these study sessions, these groups of students took a quiz. Who do you think did better? Go ahead and guess. If you guessed the first group, you'd be right. Those that crammed right before the exam did better than those who used testing as a study method. If you use this final quiz as a formative assessment, you might think that cramming is more effective than testing. But what happened a week later when these groups of students were tested again? Remember, we want the students to actually learn the material long term. Who did better in a week? The group that relied on traditional study cramming alone did worse than the test group a week later. In fact, the group that tested themselves the most remembered the most. This study suggests that formative assessments may not be the best judges of long-term learning. Poor performance on short-term assessments do not necessarily mean poor performance on long-term assessments. For a real-world example, think about exams in college. Across the country, students beg, plead, and bargain with their professors to avoid cumulative final exams, where the entirety of the semester's material is fair game. Why is that so? The typical college strategy is to cram 15 minutes before each exam during the semester, but this cramming strategy has very few long-term benefits. With this method, students may do well on each unit exam and then spectacularly fail the final. Little of the information was actually retained. One way to combat this is to integrate testing as a study method rather than just an evaluation method. So how can you integrate testing more into studying? Testing should be used as a study aid more so than traditional review and rereading. Assigning regular quizzes or pre-tests are some good alternatives. But remember, testing may result in poorer performance on these formative assessments, but it will have a significant positive impact on the summative assessments. Because of this difference in performance on the two types of assessments, it may be important to consider non-evaluative testing. Non-evaluative testing will help the students develop good study habits without worrying about the initial lower quiz scores. Remember, integrating testing into studying is good for summative assessments and great for long-term learning.